Molly Horan, an alumna of Central Connecticut State University, is a graduate of the New School's MFA program in writing for children and young adults. She has worked as a web writer and editor focusing on entertainment writing at sites like KnowYourMeme and Refinery29, and is currently an English professor teaching writing for young adults and writing for the web at NYU and SVA.
Hi everyone, thanks everyone for coming. Yeah, I was at Central, I was just trying to do the math. I started here 14 years ago, which was the summer that I worked in the bookstore. If anyone here who knows me will already know this is amusing, and I'm sure as time goes on and you see that I don't want to look up, it'll become increasingly amusing, but I started as an acting major here. that was a really bad idea. Then promptly switched to poli-sci, then history, I think women's studies for a bit there. I switched my majors a lot and eventually came to writing, which was the correct choice. And I had a fantastic writing instructor, Mary Collins, who encouraged me to apply for grad school. And I went to grad school originally actually for writing creative nonfiction, because that's what I took in Mary's classes, and they were very inspiring classes. And quickly found that everyone there were writing memoirs. And I was 20, and I spent most of my life reading quietly in a corner, so my memoir would have been very short. And all I was reading was young adult literature, so I decided to switch into that. For people who aren't familiar with young adult literature, normally, I hope this is changing. A traditional touchstone that people normally say is, do you mean like Twilight? Literally, technically, legally, yes. That is a big hit in YA literature, but YA literature is, any novel that is from the perspective of a teenager. Not always. The most famous version, if anyone read The Lovely Bones, that's not YA, and I think that was just a marketing decision. But I always like to say, if you haven't read YA since you were a teenager, I suggest getting back into it. A lot of exciting things are being published in YA. And in addition to always having a teenage protagonist, I think it ends on a sense of hope. I have distinct memories of, being a young teenager and reading adult novels for the first time, and, beautiful prose, and I was learning a lot, and I'd kind of get to the end and be like, oh no. They're saying things are going to be bad, and things might continue to be bad. And even though I think YA gets a bad rap for being, possibly depressing, a lot of the dystopian ones get a lot of top billing in movies. Normally, even like when the society's been burned to the ground, like the teenagers look at each other and they're like, all right, we got this, like we'll rebuild. And I think that can be very hopeful. So my novel is epically earnest, and it's a retelling of The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde. So probably people maybe encountered it in high school or college or a community theater production. When I first was in my MFA program, I had to write a novel as part of graduation, and I got an agent through that, which was very exciting, and attempted to sell that. That didn't work, so I wrote a middle grade novel, which is for kids a little bit younger. That didn't quite sell. And then actually the first book I ever sold was a picture book, but because publishing is a long, winding road, that hasn't come out yet. But I found, as a writer, I am not technically interested in plot, which is a big part of novels. So I thought, there are so many of these plots just lying around, why don't I take one? And for retellings, you're allowed to do that. So I really wanted to, if people are unfamiliar with Oscar Wilde, he was an incredibly successful, prolific playwright, poet, and was also fairly openly gay in the late 1800s, which wasn't just incredible, but it was illegal. And he didn't technically go to jail for being gay, but he basically did. So I really wanted to do a queer retelling. So this is a retelling with modern teenagers. As many Goodreads reviewers have pointed out, I do lose a little bit of the thread of the original plot as the story goes on, but the characters are pretty close, at least in name. So I want to read just the very beginning, so you kind of have a gist of the characters, and then a part that I'll explain after. But this is the very beginning of the novel. I've been told I read quickly, so I'll try to slow down. So don't kill me, but I stole your spit. This was the text I got in the lobby of Algie's apartment complex from Algie himself, who I knew had just been informed of my arrival by Mark, the night doorman. Algie likes to send texts right before actually greeting people to set the tone. But I suspected this particular text was his half-hearted attempt to mitigate my anger by dropping the bomb while we were still separated by 36 floors. Normally he's good at making me forget whatever genuinely enraging thing he's done now. It's possible the little effort he needs to put into getting my instant forgiveness makes me kind of a doormat. Taking my spit against my express wishes, however, crossed a line, and I felt a little vindicated by the fact that Algie knew that. When I reached the penthouse, Algie was leaning against the door frame wearing a top hat with the brim tipped over his eyes, an already open can of Diet Sunkist in his hand, a totally inadequate peace offering. He didn't look up when the elevator dinged, but instead said, in his best English accent, "Beverage, madam? You're trying to be cute? That's your plan? Ply me with orange soda and Algernon charm I've built up a tolerance to over the past decade? I could call the cops, you know," I said, stomping past him into his apartment, past the floor-to-ceiling impressionistic painting, past a life-size replica of the Venus de Milo, and into his room, where I sat on the very edge of his four-poster bed, an honest-to-God set piece from an off-Broadway production of Scrooge, making sure to telephonize the fact that I could leave at any second. "And what, Janie, would you charge me with? If spit theft was a crime, I would have been in juvie since the first grade." "Shut up. There was no spit theft whatsoever between you and Brett A. Maybe not Brett A, but Mitt H. How have you never had mono? Strength of character. You stole my spit. For your own good. Transporting samples of bodily autonomy across state lines is probably a crime. When you make up crimes, at least make them grammatically correct. Algie, you know I don't want to know. I've told you I don't. This is a complete violation of..." I faltered. Tired of talking, tired of arguing, suddenly hit by a wave of bone-deep exhaustion I hadn't felt since I ran the mile with 102-degree fever. In my defense, I always feel like I'm going to die when I run the mile, so I didn't really notice a difference. I flopped onto the refrigerator-sized teddy bear Algie got from whatever guy was following her room around in a lovesick haze last Valentine's Day. I felt Algie's head rest gently on my back, a sign of just how much trouble he knew he was in with me. Normally, he flung his body onto mine with absolutely no consideration of the damage his elbows could do to my kidneys. "Don't you want to know what I found?" he asked in a whisper. A register I was pretty sure I'd only heard from him on stage when he was playing someone capable of being quiet. That I'm mostly Western European, slightly Eastern European, with probably 1% something that seems totally random because genetic testing you got on a Groupon isn't as scientific as you'd like it to be, I asked. "Janie, I found a familial match." I was going to throw up, hopefully on Algie. No, I was going to pass out, or possibly become the Incredible Hulk. None of the emotions or sensations flowing through me was matching up with anything I'd ever felt before. Somehow, I got out in a death rap. "Well, Mr. St. Vincent High School Register Editor-in-Chief, way to bury the lead." My legal name is Jane Worthing, but that's not the name on my original birth certificate, wherever that is. You might know me as Bag Baby, which various sites on the internet have described as one of the first viral videos of the 21st century. I'd like to say I'm honored to be part of such an important milestone in web culture, but instead I tend to get hung up on the fact that one or more of my birth parents left me in an oversized Gucci handbag in the back of a Poughkeepsie train station. What separates me from other unfortunate infants who have been abandoned in far less infant-friendly locales and haven't reached a fraction of my view count is my dad. Of course, in that moment he hadn't quite claimed the dad mantle, but he did have his unique way with words. My soon-to-be aunt was the one who captured the moment on her flip phone as Dad cautiously approached the bag, instead of calling security like you're supposed to do in a train station when something looks suspicious. "Careful, Mickey, you don't know what's in there. Could be one of those copperheads, like the lady from the Dorchester found in the toilet," you hear my aunt say in her thick-as-hot fudge in the fridge Boston accent. If all of life's a stage, this is the opening line of the play that is Jane Worthing. Dad keeps slowly electric sliding up to the bag until, out of nowhere, up pops my 1-year-old head, little blonde pigtails flopping everywhere, big-cheeked, blue-eyed, with an expression that clearly says, "Whoever woke me up from my nap is about to get fucked up." But you know, cuter. And then Dad says, the line immortalized in late-night monologues, an SNL sketch, and a hand-drawn caricature sent us by the guy who draws the Zitz cartoons, "Jesus, Ann, people are leaving their baby everywhere these days." Which, if you think about it, and I have a lot, is pretty flippant for someone who is about to fight so intensely to become my legal guardian. "Once I picked you out of that god-awful ugly thing, that was that," Dad always said when I would ask what led a single 20-something self-professed dude bro, once I explained what that was, to adopt an unclaimed toddler. "I swear, Janie, it didn't even occur to me that you were going to be such a chick magnet." So, after a search for anyone who was missing a toddler and a lot of vetting and paperwork, Dad officially adopted me. I don't really remember Dad's days as a single parent, though they did yield some pretty amusing photos of what he thought a toddler should wear. Before my magical woman-attracting powers worked, he married Mom before my fourth birthday. So really, I've had a pretty average, normal childhood if you just ignore the first 4 years. And I did, most of the time. Did I sometimes wonder in the middle of the night who abandoned me and why, and if there was anyone out there who could explain how I got the vaguely bird-shaped scar on my ankle, or if kiwi allergies run in my birth family? Sure. But it doesn't help anything to wonder about mysteries that might never be answered. Have you ever noticed that the historians who are still looking for Amelia Earhart always seem kind of on edge? I think it's because if a mystery is big enough and old enough, you have to worry that the answer might not be big enough to fill the hole the question has carved into you. This is only one reason why I've avoided all the ways I could go full 21st century Nancy Drew and 23andMe my way into some kind of teary family reunion on a morning show. Because that's what would happen if I put out any kind of message onto any corner of the internet. Some bored blogger would pick it up, then it's a HuffPo headline, then I have 67 cousins who have all been offered round-trip airfare to the Today Show to explain that they always wondered what became of the cute toddler their forgetful aunt used to keep in an oversized tote. There is no way I could have a private moment with any recovered family members if I asked the internet for help. All the internet people would demand was their nationally televised Hallmark moment, and I'd never know if this collection of strangers with my eyes really wanted to get to know me or just wanted to visit LA. It was a decision my parents respected. It was a decision Algie mostly respected. But then DNA kit companies started advertising on the true crime podcast Algie constantly listened to. Once he understood family secrets were just a drop of drool away, he became obsessed with me getting one. Even though I told him no, texted him no, and spelled it out in carrot sticks during a particularly boring Netflix binge, he hadn't listened. And now, because Algie never listens, I had a familial match. I didn't want a familial match. My family is my dad and my mom and all the aunts and uncles and cousins who have populated my Christmases and summer vacations. But it's basically impossible to ignore a question once the answer seems within reach. It's out there. Attention has been called to it. I still think Eve might have never eaten the apple if God was just like, and here's a bunch of basic trees, now moving on to everything else in this literal paradise. It's a first cousin, Algie said as I sat up. A first cousin. Their parent is the sibling of my bio parent. My head started swimming again. That seemed too close, like too much information right away. Spit service stories I had read during long nights of procrastination all found second cousins or third step cousins twice removed to be starting points that could be investigated further or not. A first cousin is practically the end of the story, family tree fully formed. Have you? I asked, too nervous to complete the question. I didn't click into the tree. I didn't want to see it before you. I smiled a little, despite my still simmering anger. There was nothing Algie would love more than to discover the answer to a 17-year-old mystery before me or anyone else. But knowing he didn't proceed made me feel a little more open to forgiving him before graduation. Algie had been trying to convince me to track down my birth parents for as long as I could remember. Whenever he pushed it, I tried to remind myself that his curiosity came from equal parts excitement about living in close proximity to an honest-to-God mystery and his love for me. I knew that whenever he sensed some kind of emotional defense, which was usually just me not wanting to make a fool of myself, or not wanting to fool around in a public place, he thought it was because there was some kind of gaping hole in my heart carved by whoever gifted me a few chromosomes and left me behind. It doesn't matter. Someone or some people didn't want me, but my parents did. I actually think a bigger chunk of the population would have healthy family relationships if we were more willing to recognize when the ones we were born into, or produced, don't quite fit. I really can't wait for you to run for office someday on the baby abandonment platform. Give me your laptop. And there it was, a brown acorn, artfully perched on the name of my blood relative, Sandra Snoot. Oh God, I hope that wasn't my last name. My first last name. I put the cursor over it, wishing the act of clicking it would make more noise to allow this very momentous moment to seem more, well, cinematically momentous. You don't have to do anything with it, I can even take you to this amazing hypnotist downtown who can probably remove this entire afternoon from your memory, Algie said, taking my non-trackpad hand and squeezing it. I am Jane Worthing, and who I was my first year can't change that, I said, like it was a mantra I'd had all my life instead of something I had just come up with. I clicked. Family trees are pretty straightforward, but my eyes seemed to take in nothing as I manically scanned the cartoon oak suddenly taking up the screen. I closed my eyes and took a few deep breaths, trying to steady myself, or remember how to read, or both. I found Sandra's branch, parents Stephen Snoot and Emily Tennant. I let my eyes slide to the left of Stephen, one brother, born 1979, died 1988, not my birth father. I looked at Emily's branch, only child. My brain felt like it was full of rusty gears, moving and turning, but not quite latching on to what it needed to make sense of what I was seeing. Her mom's name, Emily. It's in gray. That means she was adopted, Algie said, pointing at the screen. Oh, well, that's that then, I said. I knew it didn't have to be, of course. It was possible Emily had done some detective work of her own, that she'd found birth parents and biological siblings, that she'd once met a bio-sister or brother who had a new baby girl, who she hadn't been in touch with since. I could message Sandra. I could crack down Emily's contact info. I could take a trip to New Jersey. It wasn't like I had any big spring break plans anyways, but Emily's gray name felt like a sign. The universe had given me an amazing family, and I worried I might offend it if I tried to work out what had happened before. And I actually had a lot of respect for the universe. I didn't want to find out what happens when you offend it. Are you sure? Algie asked. The last thing I remembered being 100% sure of was my decision to get the purple Big Kid bike with the pink streamers instead of the lime green one with the yellow basket when I was 7. But I nodded anyways. I really wanted to be sure.
Questions?
Yeah.
Is that bag baby a real thing? Did that actually happen?
No.
Oh.
But so it's in the source material, not to spoil the plot of The Importance of Being Earnest, but he was left in a handbag. And there's it's a farce, so there's a mix-up.
I'm dying to find out how you came up with some of the physical comedy that you ended up using in the book. It is so funny. And I couldn't tell whether or not you had the scene and then wanted to put it in, or the scene happened organically as you wrote the book. But they're so funny. There's many of them.
I think it has to, I teach my students how to plan out novels. I think it's a good way to do things. I don't. I just sit down and write and then later have a mess to contend with. So I know that I gravitate towards writing dialogue, so I have to add action. So it is a conscious choice of saying, make them not just be sitting and talking.
You have a really strong voice. Your character has a really, really strong voice. Did you work at that? Was that initial? That voice was initial?
I think so. Yeah.
Because the characterization of her comes right through.
I mean, now I'm worried I'm, writing a second book that it'll just sound the same. So it's possible we'll have to be a more conscious decision to alter it, but the second one. But this one seemed, pretty natural.
Very strong, very reminiscent of Salinger.
I hope happier.
Your character is the
Yeah,
voice.
yeah, very funny. So funny.
Okay, so of all the plots that are out there that you could have taken, right? Why The Importance of Being Earnest?
I think, first I went to the master list of things that are in the public domain, which is fewer than you'd think. I love, so a big chunk, entirety of Jane Austen is in the public domain, and I really love Jane Austen, but there's been so many adaptations, and especially even so many YA adaptations, and there hasn't really been as many Oscar Wilde ones. And I had just finished teaching, Picture of Dorian Gray, which was darker than anything that I wanted to wade into. And The Importance of Being Earnest, I've always loved it. It was the first show that my high school did when I was a freshman, and then I got to do it in community theater, and it was always a lot of fun.
I'm just wondering if there's a market in YA literature for theater, and I'm wondering if you ever thought about writing plays.
Yeah, so actually I write musical theater, which is fun, and trying actually to maybe adapt my picture book into a short musical, but it's weird. So technically, there's TYA, theater for young audiences, but that normally means much younger kids. And then there's, I don't know if anyone's heard of the Broadway show, Be More Chill. It was on Broadway, and teenagers and preteens really loved it because it's based on a popular YA novel. So there's been some crossover, yeah.
I want to raise my hand again because I have two really good writers behind me here, and I would love you to talk a little more about how did you crack through the difficulty of getting noticed and getting published, and what were some things you did to help you pop up with this good book? How did you get someone to look at it, take it, and make it happen?
Yeah, I actually, the process of me starting to look for an agent when I had what I thought was a book completed as some very kind agents very early on in the process, I think it was not even 40,000 words. That's not a full novel. I didn't realize that at the time. And agents never, they're very busy people. They just have to say no thank you. But very kind people are like, hey, this is interesting. You have to make it longer. So I always appreciate that. But it took, 10 years from starting that process to getting a book deal. But what's good about publishing is it's really straightforward. And you actually, once the hard part is writing the book and redrafting the book, and, getting feedback if you have teachers and peers, but, all agents have their information. So I really wish I remember where I got this piece of advice because it's a really good one. If you have books that you're like, this is what I want to write, or I think my voice sounds like this, if you go to the acknowledgments, they'll thank their agent. So then you can literally email the agent and, in describing your own project, say, I really, this book resonates with me and I hope to be telling a story in a similar way so they know that you're familiar with their work. But you just kind of have to keep querying technically how I got my agent was something called a Twitter pitch contest. They hold them throughout the year if you just Google them. And it's, a day they'll say, okay, on, December 17th, for the day, there are different rules. Normally it's about like every hour. You can tweet out a summary of your book. So whatever, I'm not on Twitter enough. I know it's like 250 characters now maybe. And then they'll have a hashtag, whatever the pitch contest's name is. And then all day agents and editors will be looking for that hashtag. And they'll have in their bio what they want you to do. So it might say, if I like your project, send me the whole manuscript, which is a big deal because normally when you're querying, you only give them maybe like 10, 20 pages. And so that's just good. It speeds up the process. So, I think I was querying for about a year and a half before I did that. And normally, so I was getting all rejections, but it could take anywhere from like a month or 6 months. So the Twitter pitch contest, I think it was like in the middle of the week. By the end of the week, who would be my agent, said he wanted to represent me. So it just means, agents are just people with taste. So you're sending them and hoping for the best, but with the Twitter pitch contest, they're like, yeah, like that sounds interesting. So that can be helpful. And that is another thing that I think is really, really important to remember is that agents are just people with taste. An agent, I know this sounds made up, could literally read your book and be like, this is brilliant. This is going to be a bestseller, but I hate dragons. I can't deal with dragons. I'm not going to deal with dragons. And they might say that, but they have, an agent might have to work with your book for over a year and a half. So even if they're like, this could make me a lot of money, if they, know each page, they're going to be like, dragons. They're gonna want to avoid it. All my hypotheticals are nonsense. My students make fun of me for it. But that is, again, I know if I got this advice earlier and I got various ones, I'd be like, that's made up. You're just saying that to make me feel better. It really is true. So that's why it can take so long, even if you have a good book. And what is good is normally what will happen if your book is in solid shape is even as you're getting rejections, you're still getting not form rejections, right? Where, an agent might literally say, this is great, keep querying, I don't like dragons. Or they might say, this is great, I don't quite like the ending, can you tweak it? And in that case, you have to decide whether that makes sense to you, right? If you're like, no, that's terrible, that would ruin my book, don't do it, it's not the agent for you. If you're curious about it, then try it, knowing that that gives a better chance of the agent saying yes, but they still might not be quite sold with the new ending. So never change something the agent wants if that doesn't kind of resonate with the story you're telling. But those are my big querying pieces of advice.
That is great.
So how long did it take from your saying, okay, I'm going to use the importance of being earnest, to the time when it was in shape to pitch to an agent?
That is something I should know the answer to. I don't. I can tell you the novel that I'm writing now that's on contract. I was able to sell it just with kind of a pitch, and then the pitch had to be thoroughly reworked. And technically, it originally was due at the end of the month. I've just got an extension, but I've finished about half of it, and I have to finish, the whole one in about a month. So that will be 2 months. That's probably too short. probably don't do that. But I write pretty quickly. And then now I am lucky enough to have, my agent and my editor to help me develop it. I'm not nearly, I do all the things that I tell my students not to do, which I'm not as diligent about the redrafting process as you should be. But yeah.
So which do you prefer? Being under contract and having to produce, or sort of having some freedom to kind of let it grow organically?
I like contracts. That's what's driving. And deadlines, and it makes, it is reassuring. It is reassuring to know that this is going to turn into something. The 2 books that didn't sell, I learned things from them. I am incredibly grateful that my first one didn't. Looking back, I'm like, that was a mess. But knowing that this book will, come to something makes me feel better when I, take a weekend and be like, I'm gonna write a book. That sounds like a job. Not that you shouldn't do it if it's not a job. It's important either way. It just makes me feel better.
Other questions? So what are you working on now?
So right now I am working on a novel about a asexual teenager who is navigating her first romantic relationship, and at the same time she feels like no one listens to her advice. So she's the stage manager at her high school theater department, but she feels kind of steamrolled by the actors who kind of are more loud and vibrant than she is, and so she starts giving anonymous advice on a TikTok-like app. So she cloaks her identity, gives advice, and it becomes really popular among her classmates, but they don't know it's her. So she's really kind of enjoying the power of they are listening to her advice because they don't know it's her, but they believe that this is like, some person in the middle of the country that don't know them. So they're confessing things to this anonymous person. And so now she has all this information. So she has all their secrets, but they don't know that she has all their secrets. And she, starts with certainly good intentions to use this information to their benefit, but eventually she starts to use the information to her benefit.
Molly, that's a good plot. You said you didn't like plot.
It took a long time.
That's a really good plot.
I did not borrow this plot. This plot took a lot of. It is a novel that I am writing for a contract and also for my PhD thesis. And so normally I would pitch something to my thesis advisors and they'd be like, great. And then I'd send that to my editor and she's like, no. And so then I change it and I bring back it to my PhD theater and they'd be like, we have to change it. So there was a lot of writing and back and forth. So now it seems to be in a place where it is pleasing a lot of people. My PhD is in England, so it's like pleasing people in different continents, but seems to be in good shape. So we'll see if they like it when it's done.
So Professor Collins has told us that you've done like stand-up and other humor things. What are some of your like inspirations for writing humor?
Probably writing humor. Have you read John Green at all, or a little bit? Yeah. So that definitely is, I think, one of the funnier YA authors writing now. I still really love to go back to Mark Twain. I think he's great, and mostly probably from TV. There's so much great humor writing on TV. And when I was doing stand-up, I was going to a lot of different stand-up shows. So in New York, you can go to, like 3 stand-up shows on the same street in one night. So there was no, I was seeing a lot of really different comics, different ages, different backgrounds, different places in their careers. Stand-up comedy is a really crazy place where you can be in like the bottom of a basement with a bunch of people that this is the first time they're doing it and they did it on a dare, and then like 2 people from SNL. And it just, because people are so, even people who are very far in their careers, they want to try out new material. They want, to be heard. So that, I think, is kind of a mixing of experience levels and even fame that you don't see in a lot of different industries. So that was very inspiring, I think.
if it gets made into a movie, have you thought about the casting for the mother character?
I'll give that some thought, Ma.
Nepotism.
Just asking.
I'm interested in how you use social media in your novels, right? And I guess it's such a staple of contemporary life that maybe to not use it would be somehow untrue. But is it something that just comes naturally to you, or kind of?
I didn't include it much in Epically Earnest. Very afraid of dating the book too quickly, and also, I haven't been a teenager using social media in a very long time. So, I waste a lot of my time on TikTok, but I know that the videos I'm getting and the way I'm interacting is the way of a 30-something person, not a teenager. YA authors, I think in general, and so there are a lot of very young people publishing in YA right now. I got a chance to interview a very talented author. She's still in college, so they can still, just say, how am I using social media? But I think a lot of, especially, YA authors who are even older than me have decided, I don't want to deal with it. The one that I always go back to, there's a novel called Winger, which takes place contemporary. It makes sense that teenagers would be using social media, and it's at a prep school, and the prep school takes all their smartphones, and there's no internet. And it's like, okay, that makes sense in this world. That's how the author isn't going to deal with it. So I've had to kind of figure it out. I know that when I finish this new one, because it does, so the platform isn't going to be called TikTok in the book, because my editor says that's illegal, not a good thing to do. But I definitely will want to, maybe recruit some of my students who are willing to be beta readers to say, hey, what seems weird? What makes it very apparent that an old person has written this?
Curious, is there pressure to cover certain kinds of topics in YA novels? Or, you're likelier to get published if you do? Or is it, the field's open?
I think the field's pretty open. So even though there has been a great, renaissance of queer YA, there are fewer bisexual protagonists, so that was important to me to include, in my book, and plus it's Oscar Wilde, I wanted it to be queer. As far as the new project, again, even though there's increasingly more representation for ace characters, there isn't a ton, so that's something that I wanted to explore, but certainly, if you are not interested in exploring, queer identity, you don't have to. Oh, yeah.
So, do you primarily focus and enjoy contemporary YA fiction, or do you ever read or write things like in fantasy or sci-fi or anything along those lines?
So I the middle grade book I wrote was fantasy, and I so admire people who can world build fantasy, and I that's something that I'm interested in working on. But I do primarily love to read contemporary and write it right now, but I teach YA, and I know so many of my students, their passion is fantasy and sci-fi, so I try to keep up a little more so I know what they're talking about when they're making references. But yeah, it's certainly something I'd like to do, but right now there are so many talented YA authors doing it, I'm just not nearly there.
All right, well, thanks very much, Molly.
Thank you for having me.
And please come back.